Is that pointed the right? That's good.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I'm David Azarewicz. I'm one of the founding members of Arca Noae. So we're the ones responsible for getting things moving again. And I primarily do device drivers. That's kind of my specialty, and I'm pretty knowledgeable about how they interface with the kernel and all that. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's happened since last year and what's going to be happening coming up in the near term. So first of all, let's talk about the ACPI project. Not much has changed recently, but since last Warpstock, since the last year, and since Arca Noae was founded actually, we changed the Warpit installer a little bit to allow installation on regular OS2 systems and to allow installation on a more variety of kernels as well. I added an SMP safe high-res timer. Many people may not know what that is or why that's important, but it has to do with, like Firefox, for example, uses it for timing things accurately. And some other things may as well, like MPlayer, I believe, uses it as well. So more accurate timing on SMP systems, because the one that was provided in the kernel has issues on SMP systems. It doesn't report times accurately. And also ACPI CA updates. ACPI CA is the module that's provided by Intel, which provides all the interfaces to the ACPI in the system. So we continually keep that up to date. So as an end result, we now have an ACPI module, a PSD, that's pretty stable and pretty reliable and works almost everywhere with no tweaking or options. And new versions of the PSD, of the ACPI project, are available on the Arca Noae subscription. So everybody know what that is? The Arca Noae subscription service? Yes?
No.
No. Well, if you go to the Arca Noae website, arcanoae.com, and click on the shop, is it still called shop?
Shop.
Shop. You can buy things there. A lot of products that are available for OS2, including the software subscription, or the update subscription. And a lot of things are in there. All the new things that Arca Noae is developing are in the software subscription, including the ACPI project. In the future for ACPI, we will of course continue updating the ACPI CA from Intel because, they release a new version about every month. And there's not a lot of changes anymore, but sometimes there's some, and you never know. Sometimes it may help compatibility with newer systems, or sometimes it may fix something that's broken. So we kind of keep that up to date. And another thing that I have planned for the future for the ACPI PSD is I now have 2 systems in my test lab that are EFI systems. And 2 out of 2 of those systems, the BIOS fails to initialize the hardware properly on boot up the first time. So that kind of tells me something, that something's getting left out of these systems. It does initialize it properly the second time, just not the first time. So I'm going to look into, try to figure out why that happens and see if I can add something into the PSD to help with system initialization at that time. Since the PSD loads very, very early in the boot process, before pretty much anything is configured, it's capable of doing system initialization stuff. So that's what's going on with the ACPI project. Any questions about the ACPI project? Does anybody have questions about what the ACPI PSD does in the system? Well, so that you can ask questions because, what the hell is ACPI anyway? That's a good thing to talk about. Yeah. ACPI is an interface, advanced configuration and power interface, that is provided by the system manufacturer in the BIOS. It's essentially a set of tables that describe the system and how it works. And the PSD that is generated by the ACPI project for OS2 is a driver. It's a platform-specific driver. That's what PSG stands for. It's a platform-specific driver that the kernel loads really, really early in the boot process and calls in to initialize the system, to basically set things up in the system, to configure interrupts, to turn on secondary CPUs, that sort of thing, and to provide a general interface to the ACPI tables that are provided by the vendor. And that's basically a driver, and that's how it works. It allows interface to the BIOS, basically, the BIOS tables, to describe the system, and then we use that to, it tells the, it provides information about what interrupts are available, what devices there are, what addresses they're at, what interrupts they can use. If they can use multiple interrupts, it tells about the mapping. And that's, the PSD basically does all that, reads the tables, configures the system so that everything works by the time the kernel gets around to using them.
Can I ask you one thing?
Of course.
The motherboard I gave you, when it starts up and the ACPI thing loads, a red thing comes up and says something about it couldn't initialize all the PCI interrupts.
Oh, really?
So what does that mean, and should the red alarm me? Or?
Yes. Well, that has to do with a limitation in the OS2 kernel. The OS2 kernel can support a maximum of 32 different interrupts. And that's kind of hard-coded into the kernel. And it would require a lot of hacking to change that. So we're kind of stuck with 32 distinct different interrupts. It is possible, however, for the hardware to provide more than 32 interrupts. And in general, most systems don't. They have one 8-bit, which is an advanced programmable interrupt controller, and one of them provides 24 interrupts, usually. And that's, that's well within the tolerance of what we can support. Well, some motherboards have more than one interrupt controllers, providing more than 32 interrupts. And if hardware is connected to those interrupts that are higher than 32, then they just won't work.
Maybe that's why they have the...
That's very likely. Now that you mention that, that's very likely.
Oh, okay.
And the ACPI tables provided by the vendor give mapping. So, if it's possible to remap them to a low interrupt, the PSD will do that. If it's not possible, there's really nothing you can do about it.
So where do if one of those offers 24 and two of them would offer 48, do you have any idea where they would have come up to 32 as being
Well, 32 is a nice round binary number. And, when I allocate arrays or structures, I always pick 8, 16, 32, 64 because, they're powers of 2. It's common to do that.
So it's just the 32 rather than...
And think about when the kernel was written.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no such thing as an advanced 8-bit,
Yeah.
No such thing. It was PICs, and there were two of them.
One more bit, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more bit would be nice. But unfortunately, there's tables, and there's maps, and the kernel stores interrupts in a 32-bit variable. There's 1 bit per interrupt. So if you go past that, you basically ran out of bits. And it's kind of hard to fix that. So anyway, yeah, back when the kernel was written, there was only PICs, and there were 2 of them, and they were 8 interrupts each, and there was 16, 32 was double that, plenty, right?
How does this relate to the issue of the computer suspending and hardware not coming out of this, or software not
It has
coming out
nothing to do with that. ACPI is involved in suspend and resume, and basically by using the ACPI interface to tell the BIOS to power off, or suspend, or wake up, those sorts of things. It's responsible for that. And the primary reason, well, there are so many different reasons that a system may not suspend or a system may not resume, that it's really hard to tell one way or the other. Most people don't have a problem with suspending because essentially the ACPI daemon goes and calls all the drivers and tells them to suspend themselves, and then it tells the kernel, okay, we're shutting down, and then it tells the BIOS to go ahead and suspend. And usually all that works. Even if things didn't succeed properly, the system will shut down. Now, bringing it back up, well, if things didn't suspend properly, well, then they're probably not going to resume properly. And that's usually where you have the trouble.
So it's in an application?
It's usually in drivers. It's usually in the drivers, most likely. drivers either didn't suspend the hardware properly or they can't resume it. One of the issues that is a real problem is that in the SMP kernel, there is no API to freeze the system when you're going to suspend. There was in the Warp 4 kernel. So you could tell the system freeze, basically stop running everything when you shut the power off. Well, that doesn't exist in the SMP kernel. So it's kind of like a guess as to whether you still have threads running or you still have I/O going on when you cut the power. And that's an issue. That's a really big issue. And I spent some time investigating if there's a workaround, a way I can work around that somehow, and I don't have a solution to that yet, although that's on the list to be worked on.
It seems like a rather striking omission. Was it an accident?
Well,
There must have been a reason.
The SMP kernel, as you've heard in other presentations, was never designed to be a end-user kernel. It was designed to run on servers only.
And you wouldn't normally.
And you would never suspend a server. So they took all that out. But now things have changed. Everybody's got multi-core systems. You know, even in my pocket, I got a multi-core system. You know, so things have changed in the couple of decades or so that have transpired since then. All right, so, you know, that's kind of the situation as it's been through. It's on the list to be worked on, but it's not one of the highest priority things, as you'll find out later on. Any other questions on ACPI?
I just got one comment. Yeah. I was using the bootable program to make a bootable CD.
Yeah.
They offer a number of different graphics to use when you bring up the workplace shell. And for me, the Snap graphics was the best. And I think without that Mac CPU equals 1 possibility in ACPI, I just would not have been able to go anywhere. Most machines I make it with, it freezes just as it begins to go into graphics. But with Mac CPU 1, it usually works.
Yeah, a lot happens in that transition into graphics mode. An awful lot. Essentially, the system only runs one CPU until then. I mean, the other CPU started, but it's just spinning, waiting to get told it can run. And right at the time the graphics mode switches on, it frees up that CPU to let it start running tasks. That happens, plus the BIOS is being called to switch, if using Panorama, to switch the screen resolution, and just a whole bunch of things start enabled right at that time. It's a real critical time in the system. And I've seen that exact problem where the BIOS can't handle SMP mode at that time that this video is switched, and that will hang the system. That's the most common thing I've seen. And you know, it's hard to say what really is going on there, but yeah, that's a real critical time in the system. That's why you see most hanging happen right at the time the desktop starts up. So much is going on at that time. Okay. JFS has been updated, the JFS file system. Does everybody know what the JFS file system is? Anybody want me to tell you what that is? Good.
How did you update it? Do you have source code for it?
Yeah. Yeah. The new version, of course, was released in the Arca subscription. I don't remember the version number right offhand, but there's a very, very important fix in this version, and if you're not running the new one, you should be. There was a very serious problem which caused the log redo to corrupt your volume and not tell you. And mark it as clean and safe, and then you go on running it, and you're running a corrupted volume. The problem is not actually in the log redo, and not actually in the checklist. The problem was actually in the file system writing improper journal entries into the log. And then when the log redo goes to try and fix up the disk, it does it incorrectly, thinks it did it correctly, and then you have corrupted volumes with cross-linked files. Basically, that's the problem that occurs. You have cross-linked files. And it thinks everything's fine. And you can run for days, months, weeks, years, and never know until you get the problem with the files that are cross-linked. And things could have cascaded so far that there's no way to recover. So this is a really important fix that got put in here. So I would recommend you get it and you run it. There are still a couple of known problems with JFS. These are really, really rare, and they're on the list to be worked on. And of course, we have priorities and limited manpower, so They're not being worked on right now, but they are known. There's a problem with check disk where it will fail with the metadata, fail reading metadata, and it really shouldn't fail. It should just try and, okay, give up on that and go on and continue running, but it doesn't. And there's a problem when you have a very, very heavily loaded system and very, very large disks. And that is, needless to say, extremely difficult to reproduce because it takes a month to reproduce the problem. So that's not really.
Define very large disk.
2 terabytes with on the order of tens of thousands of files. Is that correct, Robert? What is that numbers?
I had a backup disk system in Genesis, and it was running multiple backup streams with Arca, and was writing away to the disk on the ACPI system. It would blow up, and this was avoiding the problem when you had something in the order of more than 500,000 files on it, probably something like 50,000 directories.
Yeah, very, very large disks. Lots and lots of data on it.
And when it blew up, what was the symptom? What did you see at that point? I mean, the
Trap, right?
the trap or?
Trap in the JFS out.
That's right, the trap. Yeah. But neither one of these things are very likely to be seen, and many of you probably have never seen them, but we do know about them and will be worked on eventually. Now USB, a lot has happened on USB. We have a little bit of history about the USB 11 as opposed to the USB 10. The USB 11 means the 11 dot whatever, and USB 10 were the old versions. We really needed a stable USB stack that worked reliably on most hardware. And although there was progress being made, there was a lot of experimental development being done, which fixed some things but broke other things, and we really needed something that was going to stay reliable. So I created the version 11 branch, and I started with, or incorporated, the code that the other developers were working on, like Lars and Wim and the other people that are working on the USB stuff. So that's, we basically got all of the development work that had been being done up to this point. And then I fixed most of the regressions that had happened. I know a lot of you may have had experiences where the USB stack worked one time, and then you loaded another version, and then things stopped working. Well, hopefully all those things were fixed. In addition to that, I found and fixed some very long-standing problems that had never been addressed. And ended up with what is now the most stable and reliable USB stack we've ever had. There may still be a few problems, but they are really, really rare. And in order to work on any remaining problems, either I need to be able to reproduce them on my equipment, or I'm going to need very specific data on the problems or on the other systems. And so far, none of that has happened.
Well, that motherboard also. One thing that happens, I use a KVM,
Uh-huh.
and when I switch to the OS2 box, I sometimes have to switch 2 or 3 times, and then it'll say it found a new USB device before the mouse will work.
And
Keyboard doesn't have the
which
issue.
versions are you using?
The most recent, I always take and install the most recent
Okay.
hardware on my stuff.
Well, I always have KVMs on all my test equipment because there's way too many systems to have.
Yeah, so anyway,
Right.
it's just an annoying little thing. So.
Yeah, that is, and it should work. And that was one of the issues that I did work on, actually,
Oh.
and got it to work. So it'll be interesting to try that out. One of the other things that I did work on was the USB calls interface. The USB calls interface is a DLL and driver that is used by a lot of the USB-enabled applications like scanners, printers, those sorts of things. And the version that is released with the current USB stack incorporates, or at least attempts to incorporate, all of the different versions of the USB call interface that were out there, fixes some problems in it, and works extremely well for all the tests that I have been able to run on them and all the tests that I've heard about being run on them. So we should have a pretty reliable USB calls interface as well. And I also re-enabled all the rec stuff, so that also works. Wim Brule was very instrumental in helping do a lot of that work. So thanks to him for that. In the future, I have been looking at implementing a USB 3 driver to add to our suite of drivers. It's on the list to be done. It doesn't look like that big of a project, so I will get to it. Okay, I'm sure that's pleasing to a lot of people.
Is USB 3 storage only, or is it all kinds of devices?
I don't see why it would matter.
Okay.
USB 3 is fully backward compatible.
Right. From my point of view as a device driver writer, all I need to do is write that little piece that talks to the hardware and communicates with the stack. And whatever
Right.
the stack does with it, it does with it. So, all right. Any questions? USB.
So when are you going to finish?
That's the big question, isn't it? Yeah, well, tomorrow if I had my choice, but I don't think so.
Before 4.0 comes out.
There is, yeah. So there's some more important things going on right now. So this is waiting at this point. You know, I've done some little bit of investigation into it, not very much, just real superficial, to kind of just try and get an idea of what would be required to implement this. And it's real superficial at this point, but it's in the plans. Okay, moving on. MultiMac. This is what's been taking up all of my time recently. A little bit of history about MultiMac. It started out as a few individually written NIC drivers. Does everyone know what MultiMac is? Anybody not? MultiMac is network drivers, or OS2, network drivers.
Like Snap or Nix.
Snap is for video.
But it's the same idea. Everything's going to be a package. Everything will work then.
Well, it's not the same idea. It is a framework for building drivers, but the end result is individual drivers, not a combination of all the drivers in one package. And like I said, this started out, there were a few individually developed drivers. There was E1000, there was Realtek, there was the NVIDIA driver. And that's kind of how they started out. And the first thing I did was try and merge them all together because all NIC drivers share a lot of common code that doesn't really need to be rewritten or re-implemented for each different driver. So that was the first stage. And then the second stage was they were reworked to use one of my device driver kits, the 16-bit driver kit. And that further simplified what was needed to write a new driver. The NVETF driver and the E1000E driver both currently use the driver 16 kit. And as you'll find out a little later, those are, well, the NVETF is still probably going to stay around. The E1000 is going to stay around, but it's been superseded by other drivers now. Once that was done, the whole goal of MultiMac was to try and make it as easy as possible to produce new NIC drivers. You know, because there's not a lot of manpower here, and the shorter amount of time, the less amount of work it takes to build a new driver, the better. You know, it takes 3 months, that's a lot of time when you could be doing other things. So all of these steps are trying to get towards that goal, to produce a new driver as quickly as possible. So then we had been working with Linux drivers, you know, using the Linux drivers as a skeleton or as a guide to writing the new drivers for OS2. So what I decided to do is write a compatibility library that produced a lot of the pieces that needed to be rewritten over and over and over for each different driver, kind of put them all in one library so that they wouldn't have to be done each time. So that you could take a Linux driver and massage it as little as possible and produce a native OS2 driver. Well, that worked to a certain extent, and the R8169 driver uses that library and my 32-bit driver kit. So the R8169 driver is a 32-bit driver, and it uses these two kits. But I found that even though this new driver, this new library, the compatibility library, was a big help, it still was a lot of work to port a Linux driver to OS2. And the main reason is because Linux driver model is so radically different than the OS2 driver model, a lot has to be changed in the Linux code to make it compatible and link into OS2. So it still took somewhere between 1 and 3 months to produce a new driver. still not acceptable. So we looked at FreeBSD. FreeBSD was chosen because the driver interface is a lot closer to what OS2 does. So less work would need to be done to massage the code to work and compile on OS2. And the goal was, when I started this, was to produce a library and a toolkit that would allow me to take a FreeBSD driver and make little or no changes to the source code from FreeBSD and just compile it and have it run on OS2. Well, that has been done, and that works pretty well. And as a result, several new drivers have now been produced using this new compatibility library. And we went from 1 to 3 months development time to between 5 and 15 minutes to produce a new driver.
Pretty good.
Pretty good.
Who writes the FreeBSD for us?
The FreeBSD folks. And FreeBSD code is open source under the BSD license, so we are free to use it.
And is it as rich as Linux? Or in
Not
terms of the hardware
as well.
support?
No.
Yeah, that's the,
But it's pretty good. It's a lot more than we have now. And it is still in development. So, as they update, since practically no changes are required to the source modules, it's really easy to update or produce new drivers.
But those are hobbyists writing those things, or companies who?
Very much like Linux. There's bunches of people working on it. FreeBSD is used more in embedded systems than Linux is, but it's still pretty complete. Anyway, there are several new drivers, and if you look on the Arca Noae website, you can see them. There are several of them there. I don't remember which ones they are at this time, but there are several of them there, and I'm working on a few others. As I port each new driver, sometimes they use kernel services that I haven't implemented yet. Sometimes they don't. If they don't use any kernel services that I haven't implemented, then the 10 to 15 minutes to do it is accurate. If they did use other kernel interfaces, then I got to implement those 1 or 2 things that they did, and it might take me an hour or so. Still, a big help over the way we used to do it before. And I am willing to take suggestions. If you have hardware NICs that don't have drivers, give me the PCID of the NIC that you have, and I'll try and produce a driver for it. It's not a lot of work anymore. What is a lot of work is wireless, and that is what I am currently working on. I am working on the wireless portion of this compatibility library for the wireless drivers. And I've done a lot of work on it already. I am partially compiling the Intel wireless driver right now. It's not working yet. I would guess that I'm probably 60% done with it. But that is what's taking my time, and that is actively being developed right now. Once I get the driver compiled and actually working with the hardware, I will need to also develop a WLAN interface for it. So that will take some time as well. But ongoing right now. One thing to keep in mind with this new system, at least, with the FreeBSD drivers, you did hear me say that I do not make any changes to the FreeBSD source. What the changes I do make is I add a couple of include files to the front of it. And I add one structure into the code, which gives me entry points into the driver. But that's it. So I do not look at how the driver works. I don't understand how it works. So there's no development whatsoever on these drivers, which means if you load it and it doesn't work, kind of too bad. We don't debug it. There's no development. It means we don't add new chipset features, nothing like that. Now, the only thing that I can check out is, did it load properly? Did it load all the modules it needed? And I can, of course, debug the OS2 interface, the compatibility library that I'm working on. But if it loads, doesn't track, and just doesn't work, Still, you can open a ticket and I can try and make sure that everything loaded properly, but that's about it. These are not developed drivers, these are just recompiled. Any questions on MultiMac?
So when that happens, are you, the assumption there is that there's some issue with the original driver?
Right. Yeah, there's some issue
You're
with the
comfortable
original
enough
driver.
assuming that?
Yeah. Once I've made sure it's loaded and all the modules, and what I mean by modules, the way this module works is there's the actual driver for your chipset, like if you have, for example, a Realtek chipset. There's a driver for that, and then there's the physical interface portion. And those are actually separate modules that need to be linked in. And what I try to do when I build these drivers is I try and guess as to all the different physical interface modules it might need and link them into the driver so that you have everything you need. But I might guess wrong, and maybe you have a particular chipset that needs a different PHY driver that's not been linked in. And these messages will come out in the debug data if it's missing the PHY driver. And now just pull it in, relink it, and it'll work.
And that's you run there's a debug version of these guys as well?
No, there is no need for a debug version. Well, if you open a ticket and I determine you need a debug version, I will compile a special version just for your test setup, give that to you and have you run it, and it'll produce the specific debug data I need.
And when you run into these that fail, do you then fire up BSD and see what happens with that on the same hardware?
Do I fire what?
Well, these are BSD drivers, so do you like boot it up with BSD on the same thing that's failing and try
I did that one time.
Okay.
And normally I don't need to. Normally it's something obvious and it's easily fixable. And so far I really haven't seen one that I have not been able to fix.
Okay.
So, but you never know. Anything else on MultiMac?
Yeah, you have your library on your website for anybody to download.
No.
No, okay.
No.
Well, so I cannot ask.
Yeah.
Because I was going to ask if you have any documentation. So how can you grab the source code from FreeBSD and compile it so people can learn about it?
No, not at this time. It's still under very heavy development. It changes hourly, daily, changing very, very rapidly. No, not at this time.
I had one. Over the course of MultiMac over the years, we had a lot of Realtek systems, and they would come up with a MAC address 0. And it just kept coming back. This bug seemed to just keep coming back. Is that
I don't know why that happened. And those were with the Linux drivers.
Right.
I don't know. Does that happen with the BSD driver?
I have not got that much hardware anymore to try it on.
Because the BSD Realtek driver is just done just like I said. There's no changes to the source code.
Yeah. Okay.
So it should work exacally the same.
You probably have more of them than I do at this point.
I have quite a few.
Yeah.
And I never saw the problem with the other drivers, actually.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, I did hear about that.
Yeah.
I don't know why that happened.
I had quite a few of them, but you eventually fixed them all, so
Good.
I sold them.
Glad to hear that. We like things to work. Any other questions on MultiMac? Okay. UniOdd. Nothing's happened on UniOdd in quite some time, but it is on my list of things to do. And what I would like to do with it is rearrange it the same way I rearranged the ACPI code. And what I did with the ACPI code is I put the ACPI CA module, remember that's the part supplied by Intel, kind of isolated so that you could just drop in a new one with very little effort. It takes me probably about 15 minutes to update the ACPI CA code in ACPI. This is not a big project, so every time they release a new one, 15 minutes later I can produce a new PSB. I would like to be able to do the same thing with UniOdd. Right now, it's a big deal incorporating a new ALSA module into the UniOdd code. ALSA is the part that we get from Linux. So I would like to reorganize this to kind of isolate the ALSA code, make it unchanged from what we get from Linux, and then that'll make it really easy to drop in updates when they occur. And then also fix any of the remaining problems with the OS2 interface code. Basically, you kind of see a theme here with all these things, with ACPI and the MultiMac and ALSA, making things very easy to develop or update new things. So that doesn't take a lot of developer time, because not a lot of developer time available.
Does anyone else know how to do what you do? I mean, you have an assistant, or?
I do not have an assistant.
Okay.
Are you volunteering?
So far, just asking, but.
The assistant would be very nice, and more developers would be very nice,
Uh-huh.
because we could get a lot more done. But, there's not a lot of people in the world capable of working on OS2 drivers.
Yeah, like drivers is a pretty specialized.
It's a kind of a specialized thing. Drivers, there's a lot of people who can develop drivers, but the OS2 model's not like Linux, not like other systems. It's not like Windows. It's kind of different. And then when you have problems, like kernel problems or something, then what do you do? Then you really need somebody who knows the internals of the kernel. Yeah.
Does that guy, Garth, was that the guy that used to be at IBM?
Scott Garth?
Yeah, it used to be. I don't
Who do you ask if you can't finish?
Steve and I usually work together.
Like that?
No, well, together. I mean, yeah, we get together, we're on the phone,
Uh-huh,
sharing screens and stuff. We're in the kernel debugger together a lot,
okay.
for any kind of problems. A lot of the stuff I fix is I'm in the kernel debugger a lot. Tracing through where problems, where things go bad, and whatever. Any other questions on Uni audits? I know a lot has not happened. I know the version we have is really old and has lots of problems. Which would you rather have, Uni audit or wireless drivers?
Wireless.
That's why I'm working on the wireless drivers. Okay? If you have problems with any of the drivers. Well, before I get to this, is there anything I haven't covered?
But there's one of the, with ACPI, when you run in a virtual machine, should you never use SMP? Or is that okay to do that?
I don't see why it should be a problem.
Oh, okay. For some reason I thought you weren't supposed to.
What happens is, if you run OS2 as a guest, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, right.
Virtualized as a guest, you cannot enable multiple processors as a guest.
It all depends what virtual machine you're using.
See, I thought in VirtualBox it looked like you could ask for more than
Virtual
one
box
You
PC.
can, I mean,
You
the
can,
virtual,
you can turn it on, but what'll happen is at some point it's gonna crash.
yeah, I have not,
It's going to
on
crash.
Linux, I started it up and I booted up in Linux, but I never really, I don't play with it that much.
Yeah.
I have so much real hardware to run OS2 on, I just run on real hardware.
But yeah, sometimes it'll give you a IPE on boot, other times it won't find the hard drive, so the hard disk can't be operated. And other times it'll run for a little while and then just suddenly.
Okay, well, there's your
Yeah,
answer.
virtual box is what you said.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it works really well.
No.
Yeah, okay, so the answer is maybe not.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe not. If you do have problems with drivers, open a ticket at arcanoa.com. If you post things on mailing lists or forums, I will never see it, and it will not get addressed. You must open a ticket.
Let me add something about posting a ticket. If David says that he needs log files, that's what he needs. He doesn't need stories about, I tried my next door neighbor's keyboard and that worked.
You know,
So
I actually had a note about that. I was debating whether I say, actually when I wrote it, don't clutter your ticket with unneeded screenshots and other data that I don't need. I don't need to see screenshots. I don't need trace files if I haven't asked for them. Really, the only thing I need, I built a tool called Test Log. That gathers everything I need from your system. You just run the test log program and the log file it generates, that's usually all I need.
And that's in the USB.
It's in every package that I release, and it's also available, if you look at the wikis on arcanoa.com, it's also available there to download. And that thing, what it does, it goes and queries the system. I gather all the information about the system. It puts a copy of your config.sys in there, it goes and gathers all the log files I need, it does the PCI output, it gathers everything I need for whatever driver you're trying to debug. And that's usually all I need. And they should provide that by default, but nothing else really. The description of the problem and how to reproduce it. That's really all I need. Any other questions?
When we talk about creating a device driver
Yeah.
and we talk about the documentation, do you think that all the IBM documentation is available on the web, or is there some secret around there? Or some
IBM
secret
documentation?
Yeah, to create, or
Most of the knowledge and documentation about device drivers is in there, and Steve's head, and the source code. There is documentation. There's there's some documentation available. I don't.
There's a couple old books about it.
There's a couple old books about it, yes. And, nothing's changed in the past 20 years. So old books are just fine. The stuff is still accurate.
There is a question on the forum here.
Yeah.
It says EFI computers and ACPI initialization. I think you might have mentioned it, but I wasn't here to be able to answer for it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. We are looking at EFI systems. I have 2 of them
Now you have 3.
that has EFI in it.
You can turn it off, but it has.
Oh, okay, I agree. Yeah, there are issues, and I do know about them, and some of them should be able to be addressed in the PSV. Like any system initialization issue should be able to be addressed with that. At this point, we still do need the compatibility module to boot, but we're looking at alternatives to that as well.
The thing in the BIOS where it says you want to run it in compatibility mode rather than raw, whatever.
Right.
it is,
We do need the compatibility mode because basically that produces the normal BIOS that we call to read the disk and to change the screen and those sorts of things. We do need that at this point.
I have a suggestion for Arca. I've been working on a project with somebody, a book. He's been working 10 years on it. And I've helped him out a little bit and been through several potential publishers. They said, no, maybe this new press is going to do it. I think he's had a heart attack. I can't reach him for several days. And so it's kind of a grim thing to talk about. But if you've got a lot of intellectual property, and I've been involved in another project, my partner got Parkinson's disease and died. All I have is the schematics. So I think it's important for your firm to document all this stuff that's in your head. It's a background task. I mean, I've written several things like this, which I put up on the web for technical.
Well, that's a good point.
It's a very important thing to do.
And I know Stephen is very good at that. Stephen documents everything much better than I do. I try and put all my documentation in the source code for comments. But Stephen actually produces documents. He's really good at that. So he does have all that stuff. Anything else?
So unless he falls down in the kitchen.
That's a good point. All right, well, we have just 9 more minutes before the next presentation, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, any other oddball hardware you looked at, or?
Any other oddball hardware? Not really. I got myself an EEPC the other day.
Oh.
EEPC,
Yeah.
those team things.
Oh, the Intel boxes?
It's an Asus box.
Asus, yeah.
They're still making that? It's a new one?
There was a hand-me-down,
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got another one for my daughters.
and I installed OS2 on it, installed just fine, runs just fine.
That'll run OS2?
Yeah, it does,
Yeah.
runs just fine.
Yeah. When it came out, someone got one and showed OS2 running on, or ECS running
Yeah,
on it.
runs just fine. It needed one of my new drivers, Altera, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Huh.
needed that. So, it the network didn't work, so 15 minutes later I built a driver for it, and now it does.
What about network chips? Are there some that are better than others? Like, is Realtek a pain in the neck and Intel works better, or like?
From a driver point of view, the Intel drivers are surprisingly difficult to work with,
Yeah.
from a coding point of view. The Realtek drivers are a lot more simple and straightforward to be written than the Intel drivers.
What are they,
Realtek
like
drivers are
networks?
everywhere.
Yeah, right, it's so often where you run into, even on, I think I've got Intel motherboards with
They're
Realtek.
everywhere, so I would say Realtek. And right now, there's 3 different drivers that support the rest of the chips that we have.
Right,
And
right.
they support the same chips, but there's 3 drivers to choose from, so if one doesn't work, you can try a different one.
Will the old 3-com NICs work under ECS without any, will it automatically recognize them? You have to load drivers in?
Well, which,
589, I got a dozen of these
it
things.
depends if there's a driver. I don't know. Off the
Yeah,
top
it
of my
works
head,
with the Ethernet Excel driver. Most of those cards are detected by Ecom Station if you have them installed.
They are detected automatically.
yeah.
Because I got all these 3.5-inch steps. I don't know whether to keep those or not now.
Those are drivers,
Mhm.
dump them instantly. If you want to do yourself and everybody around you a favor, is to dump the old drivers because the Ethernet Excel driver that ships with Ecom Station was the last version. And one of the things you probably want to avoid doing is to start loading older versions of drivers. I can understand why some people know that certain versions of their older drivers work, they claim, but usually older drivers contain bugs in them. So it's better to usually stick to the latest version.
Which is in the Noae.
It's the same thing with people that want to install the SB Live driver and download it from the internet. The version that ships with ECS has the proper fixes in it for load.
Yeah. The SPI Live driver has some serious problems.
So,
System corrupting problems.
Is this your full-time job, or do you have another job? Or?
Off and on. All right, thank you very much.
Just one second. About the installable file system drivers.
Yes.
You have now JFS, but do you think it's going to be, I don't know, with the size of the hard drive growing, I need to change the file system eventually to have another one?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
Have we looked at any other file system drivers? I mean, JFS is,
We haven't
Pretty
really looked
scalable.
at any, I mean, recently, yeah, JFS is pretty much.
Yeah, on
Yeah,
other
really
operating
scalable.
systems that have larger than 2 terabyte drives, can they run JFS that's larger than 2 terabyte?
JFS
JFS
can run huge.
huge,
I
it has
mean,
64-bit pointers.
Yeah,
Yeah,
It's huge,
right.
way bigger
I mean,
than 2
ours
terabytes.
cannot, because it's limited, it's running on OS2, they can
We're
only have
limited
2
by
terabytes.
other factors,
Yeah,
not the
other
file
factors.
system.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not the files, we don't run out of addressing space because
Not because of the file system.
Yeah.
the
no.
file system driver. We run out of addressing space because we're,
There's other components lower down level.
yeah,
Well, one thing I would recommend with my experience at Menzies, and I think, I don't know, probably, I don't know, I'm guessing it's probably the last company that's running live web servers on the internet, running OS2, we're running one, but we've got there are a couple of servers that used to be running JFS volumes with 150 gigabytes of data on it, and a lot of HTML files running into the probably hundreds of thousands. And one thing that I do recommend to everybody when you create JFS volumes is to not make them too big. I've had a couple of very serious corruption issues, and whether that's purely attributable to the work that David described in what we do. And the other thing that I recommend you seriously do, and for people that are afraid of the config sys setting early in equals true, please have in your config sys. I've had a couple of reproducible issues where if you do not have early memory equals true in the config sys, on large drives, the checklist will fill the system, will run out of memory, and it will reboot. One last thing on early memory equals true. If there's anybody on the public forum that says that early memory equals true, gives technical malfunctions on the system, it's a fairy tale for me. I have yet to have cast iron proof of that. So don't take the early memory equals true out, leave it in the config sys, because in large volumes it can result in a stopping check.
How do you know about that? I don't know.
Then you're wondering why is it failing.
That's several people, and
Okay.
they might
That's
get
yes.
this. Maybe
But to look into the question that was asked about large volumes, in theory, JFS was never really tested for 2 terabyte volume, so you can do it, but the question is what's going to happen if the data store really gets big? And based on the experience I had with Mensa, some of the large volumes,
I haven't running that 2 terabyte.
how many files have you got there? How is it built out?
It's not like test case, but I filled it up like halfway.
The other issue is that it's the market thing, like the master boot records being replaced by the GPU partition
I have
system,
no idea.
something like that. And another system, what they do, they support that new master boot record, and you have partitions of 2 terabytes on a big. Yeah, it's not a file system, no, it's a master boot record.
It's a different disk layer.
Yeah.
Well, I currently know that the ceiling for hard disk size of those two, because of the limits of the kernel, it is currently hardwired at 2 terabytes. I have never had the chance to take a 3 terabyte drive and stick it in the system and see if it even works, if it even records 2 terabyte disk space. I don't even know what happens then. If anybody wants to volunteer for that, send me an email. I can, yes.
So we have which WP so much problems show up at different levels.
I don't even know, I drive some, 2 terabyte drive.
It's probably not pointed at the right one.
What's that? What's that?
Somewhere around 2 terabytes.
It's not coming out there.
Yeah.
It's not coming out there, so it must be.
Maybe it's the input, project remote.
I think it's for the Gaga, I'm just going to buy a 3 terabyte drive and see what it does, so.
I guess it's the.
Yeah. There we go.
never.
Somebody had written a program that I had to inherit. It would infinite loop if they did certain things with the GUI.
Let's,
With a performance analyzer, all I'd have to